I'm very, very excited and happy to see you all here this morning, 10 a.m. Pacific time, on Zoom for the University of Oregon Undergraduate Research Symposium, for one of the first panels of the day, excitingly. My name is Keegan Livermore. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a first-year master's student in the linguistics department in the language teaching studies program, and so I am very excited and happy to be able to be here supporting linguistics students presenting linguistics research. So it's going to be a very, very exciting morning for many reasons. We are really, really happy and excited to be here to honor the work that these undergraduate students have been doing over the past year, and celebrate their findings and their learnings through these experiences, and whatever versions of results research is able to produce. We have 3 very different projects, and I think that's going to be really cool to be able to dig into during this session. I want to remind everyone to please be respectful of each other and of the presenters, as there's a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of energy and focus that has gone into today. I want to welcome all of our non-presenter guests, if that is family or friends or faculty or support systems or whatever that looks like, as a lot of this research and a lot of student experiences wouldn't be possible without all of you. I want to ask that you stay muted for the session, just so we don't have interference or confusion. Zoom is a wonderful but somewhat confusing platform in terms of crossing things. So I want to be mindful of that. Presenters, when you are presenting your projects during the first half, I ask that you also remain muted until you are presenting or during the responding to questions during the Q&A. The order that we'll go in is we'll have the 3 presentations at the beginning. Those will be about 15 minutes each. And then after those 3 presentations, then we'll open it up for questions, which you are welcome to submit via the chat function on Zoom if you have typing capabilities. You're welcome to submit those questions during the presentation as well, so you can remember things as they come up, and then I'll be able to circle back to those afterwards when we open up for questions, focusing on the questions. I also have a number of questions as well to kind of throw into the mix for some reflection, some sharing of process and all that, because that's always a really fun thing to be able to do after you've kind of crossed the hurdle of presenting and everything. So I'm very excited to hear what the students have to share for sure. I will be keeping time, and at about 12 minutes, I'll give you a nudge of like, hey, like you should probably start wrapping it up in a sec. And that'll be a bit more verbal, so I will kind of unmute myself briefly. But we will feel it out as we go, and it will be wonderful all around. I also briefly want to just mention and shout out my co-moderator, Lynn, who is helping manage and moderate things from the back end. I get to be a more talking person this morning, and she is wonderfully helping with more of the behind the scenes stuff. So that is always an exciting part of the team effort that the symposium and presenting research is here at the UO. I also want to just remind everyone that the session is being recorded and will be put onto the Symposium YouTube page later, probably next week, excitingly. So there will be an incredible archive and documentation of the students' research presentations and of all the other presentations that are happening today. So I really want to encourage you to go and take a look at all the other projects, oral presentations, panels, posters that are happening today, because there are approximately 280 students that are presenting today, which is really exciting. And the incredible work of the symposium team and shifting from a huge in-person event usually to now in its 10th year, an online format, excitingly. And so that there's a whole bunch of work and energy that has gone into today, and I'm really excited to be able to celebrate all of that with all of you today in this session as we hear from and celebrate students and the research that they've been doing. So with that, I will turn it over to our first group, which I believe will be Danni and company, and I assume that will be Lydia and Melinda as well. So I will turn it over to you. You should be able to share perhaps a visual if you're using that, and please let me know if you have any questions.
I just want to confirm that y'all are seeing what you're intended to be seeing at the moment.
I see a Google Slides with a title and a purple bar on the bottom.
Awesome. Okay. Take it away, Sam.
Hi. Our project was demographic influences on perception of they, them pronouns. So we just wanted to determine basically like what goes into, like what is a factor when considering people's attitudes towards they, them pronouns. And so we had like a bunch of demographic factors that we were presented in a survey. Here's our research question. Which demographic factors influence people's perceptions of they, them, non-binary gender pronouns? So we're not talking about plural, we're just talking about the non-binary pronoun, and the factors that we tested were basically age, gender, political affiliation, religious affiliation, socioeconomic status, regional background, proximity to LGBTQ plus community, and the disposition towards those issues. We decided not to include ethnicity just because we didn't think it was the most pressing or relevant factor for our research question. We thought there were more groups that would have significant influence on perceptions of they, them pronouns. Our hypothesis was that we expect age to be the strongest predictor of people's perceptions of singular they. Younger individuals will have a more positive perception than older individuals. This is just based off like prior knowledge, prior perceptions.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So for our research method, we plan on doing both an interview and a survey. So we do send out the initial survey, and that would give us an idea of like what kind of correlations there were and if our hypothesis was maybe correct. And then by doing a follow-up interview, we could determine like what maybe confounds there were, and also give us additional insight as to like why age or other factors and demographics would have an influence on your perception of they, them pronouns. As of now, we have distributed the survey, but we have not done any interviews. We ran out of time, but we maybe hope to in the future. For sampling methods, again, we originally planned to distribute it online and also do some kind of in-person distribution. However, because we're all online this term, we couldn't really do the in-person ones, and it would be a little bit of a safety hazard to do that. So So we just did an online distribution, and yeah. Okay. So this was our survey. Some of the questions were about like your affiliation with the university and what your age is and your gender. And we left the gender box open and the age box open so that you could enter it. And then we had additional questions about religion and all the other demographics, like where you grew up and where you've lived the longest, were the two that like really, like they're the same question, but we decided to put them both in because they're kind of different, and it could be really influential on why you did or didn't, or how you perceive they, them pronouns. Sorry. Okay, next slide. Then in the second section of our survey, we wanted to know about how you viewed LGBT issues, and more specifically, how you viewed they, them pronouns and how you would see them when they're being used, or how you yourself would see them when they're being used. And we did this part of the survey by giving a statement about LGBT issues, and then you would choose on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree how you felt about it. Okay.
So some of our confounds and limitations when conducting this research project were, we had issues with distribution, obviously, because we weren't able to do distribution on campus. So our pool of participants was limited to people that we already knew or people that we had classes with, or professors or faculty that we already knew. We also had a late approval from the IRB, so we were late starting this project, which influenced how many responses we were able to get in the time leading up until now. We also had, because of our limited pool of participants, we had a vast majority of respondents who held a favorable view of they, them pronouns, which we don't necessarily believe is indicative of the entire population of the University of Oregon.
So all that said, we were definitely still able to get some results, even if they weren't as complete as we would have liked. Just looking at our demographics that we asked about, a few sort of things that we weren't able to find correlation. Age, unfortunately, was not evenly distributed because we were only able to sort of put the survey out amongst our peer group and classes. The vast majority of the respondents were in the 18 to 20 age range, which meant that we really weren't able to look at the influence of age, and our data did not support any correlation between age and attitude towards they, them pronouns. I mean, that's not necessarily disproving our hypothesis, though, because there's just simply not enough data. Among our sample, income, which is how we determine socioeconomic status, was not a factor that contributed to perception of they, them pronouns. And we got a lot of really great responses from regional background, both of the questions that Lydia was talking about, where you've lived the longest and where you grew up, but we simply didn't have enough time to actually, you know, separate those out into the categories that we would have needed to do to really analyze them thoroughly. So our results can't tell us about those three factors, but we were able to get data about other factors. So political affiliation was influential, and generally we found that even though our sample, obviously, as you can see from this graph, the political affiliation was not evenly distributed. And total, we only got 47 responses. So, I mean, we definitely were hoping for more data overall, but the more liberal tend to have a more positive attitude towards they, them pronouns, and the more conservative respondents tended to have a less positive attitude towards they, them pronouns. We're not really sure. I don't think that this spread is representative of the university population. I think that's definitely part of the bias that came from our sample, basically just being thoroughly through word of mouth with the people that we know. And then the sort of three that we were pretty sure would be the case. It's kind of supports what we've seen in prior research, but we still were able to definitely find evidence for these three parameters: proximity to the LGBT community, disposition towards LGBT issues, and then knowing someone who uses they, them pronouns. So all of these three factors were had a positive correlation. And basically how we reached these parameters in the strongly agree to strongly disagree questions, we sort of separated them out into three different question types. So there were questions that determined someone's proximity to the LGBT community. So that's this slide. Those are questions like, I know someone who, or like I have a friend who is identifies as LGBT. I have family who are LGBT. LGBT issues do not affect me. Questions like that. And so that sort of determines like how closely someone is connected to the LGBT community, LGBT issues, and people who had a higher proximity also tended to have a more positive attitude towards they, them pronouns. And then this is like disposition towards LGBT issues. Pretty similar. This is basically just looking at questions like gender neutral bathrooms are not necessary, or oh my gosh, I'm actually blanking on a lot of these questions, but it was about 6 or 7 questions that just sort of determined like people's attitudes on LGBT issues, with not necessarily a strong focus, but somewhat of a focus on transgender and non-binary issues specifically. And so this is another one where like that influence toward the disposition towards LGBT issues was clearly correlated with the attitude towards they, them pronouns. And then the final one, this is just a single question, was the influence of knowing someone who uses they, them pronouns, which kind of probably goes without saying, but as you can see here, the knowing someone who uses they, them pronouns, and this was just a 5-point scale, strongly disagree to strongly agree, in response to the question, I know someone who uses they, them pronouns. And knowing someone who uses they, them pronouns was a clear contributing factor towards having a positive attitude toward they, them pronouns. One thing though that you'll also notice in this data is the vast majority of our data points were in the know someone who uses they, them pronouns category, which again, I'm not sure if that's necessarily representative of the university population or of the population at large. That is definitely a place for further research. Now this one I feel kind of silly because when I put this graph together, I put a trend line on here as if male, female, and non-binary are like in a sequence in that order. So you can ignore the trend line because that's inaccurate, but there was a somewhat of an influence of gender, male and female here. And this is just gender as self-described by the respondents. We had a few different responses outside of like man, woman, male, female, something like that. And I just lumped all of those together into non-binary here. There's no statistically significant difference between male and female here, but there is a statistically significant distinction between the male and female versus non-binary. So being non-binary is a factor that leads to a, tends to contribute to having a more positive attitude towards they, them pronouns. But we did not find in our data any evidence that being male or female would influence that. Religion was a place where there's some, definitely some influence and also some not. The vast majority of our respondents were either in the spiritual but not religious, which as I was making these graphs, I had to like reformat them and ended up, anyways, they ended up not necessarily formatted right, but anyways, so we have the spiritual but not religious, and then the atheist or agnostic, and the vast majority of our respondents fell into those two categories, which had a significant, significantly higher attitude towards they, them pronouns than the religious as a whole. The 3 categories that I have here are categories in the survey were broken down smaller, but I didn't put a bar graph for anything that we had fewer than 3 responses to. So Catholic, other Christian included Protestant and Christian, which were both responses that we got. And then this other is all of our other religion responses, which included Jewish, Muslim, and Washat. And so these bars are not necessarily statistically significant in difference to each other, simply because there was a pretty small number in each of them. I think there were 4 in Catholic, 4 in other Christian, and 4 in this other. But all of the religious versus the spiritual not religious and the atheist agnostic, there was a significant distinction, statistically significant difference rather. And so that is all of the data that we were able to sort of harvest so far. We're still hoping to do some one-on-one interviews, because a big part of our research was not necessarily just trying to find out like what are the demographic influences, but why do those demographic influences have that influence? And so we're definitely hoping to still conduct some interviews. Thank you.
Thank you so much, students. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's see. Oh, yay, yeah. Pretending to clap, or clapping to yourself if you're muted, or the hands emoji. It's like, oh, it's so much fun. Yay, yay, research projects. That's so cool. I can't wait to see where that continues going, because that's obviously very, very topical and relevant to the modern world. That's so exciting. Wonderful. And again, we'll have Q&A and such after all 3 presentations, but please feel free, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to put those in the chat. I'll be able to circle back to those pretty easily. So we will move right along wonderfully with our next presenter, Chasen.
Hi, let me figure this out. Is it working?
I see a slide screen.
Cool. Okay. That is good. Sorry, one sec. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Also, thanks for that presentation. That was really cool. I'm excited to see what comes out of it. And I was really impressed that they just got IRB approval 2 weeks ago. So that's cool where they're at. So I today am presenting my senior honors thesis titled The Role of Financial Rewards in Foreign Accent Adaptation. My name is Chasen Afghani. I use she, her pronouns, and I want to thank you all for being here. So the research question of my study is how financial rewards affect adaptation to non-native speech. So when I use words like non-native speech or foreign accent speech, I mean when you're communicating with someone and you perceive that their native language might be, let's say the speaker, their native language Chinese, that means I'm perceiving them as speaking English with a Chinese accent or so on. So I just wanted to unpack that that's what I meant when I use these words, and nothing more political or meaningful than that. So what affects our perception of non-native speech? What we know so far in the field is that both cognitive and social factors affect our perception of non-native speech by native speakers. So when I say cognitive factors, I mean like when we enhance our cognitive load, it requires more effort to process something. So it is requiring more effort to process a native accent than to non-native accent than a native accent. Listeners report that accented speech is more difficult to understand, is processed more slowly, and comprehended less well than native accented speech. So the implications of enhancing a cognitive load would be all of those, plus remembering that, communication, and so on. Social factors here include a range of things, from biases against a speaker or a linguistic or ethnic group, and your motivation in that speech act, which would affect your listening effort. So this means like if a listener has a negative bias toward a speaker, they may correlate that bias with the listener's intelligibility or understand like how well they can understand them, when in reality they may be putting in less listening effort. And what is foreign accent adaptation? So we know that we can get better at understanding accented speech over time, and that's the task that we're looking at in this experiment. So a reminder, my research question is how financial rewards affect adaptation to non-native speech. So language acts as a bridge between a speaker and a listener. The role of language is to send signals from the speaker to the listener, and hopefully the listener is receiving those signals with the message that was intended. Native speakers often have challenges understanding non-native speech, as we talked about, so that can hinder the success of the communication. So when I say adaptation here, I mean that the communication over time or through various exposures to the accented speech, the native listener can be more accurate at perceiving the correct signal from the non-native speaker. So we adjust what we expect to hear to what we're actually hearing so that the intended signal better matches the perceived signal. So that's what we're looking at in this study. The methods we used are two subject groups, which are asked to transcribe unfamiliar non-native speech stimuli. So their task was, okay, you're gonna listen to these sentences and you're gonna type out what you heard as best as possible. There was 104 sentences and it took about 30 minutes to up to an hour. The control group was asked to transcribe the speech as accurate as possible, and they were told at the end they were going to get paid a certain amount. The experimental group, however, was told very similar instructions, but they were told that their payment at the end was going to be dynamic in that they were going to get paid based on how well or accurately they transcribed the speech. So if the more words they got correct per sentence, for let's say, the more they're getting paid. So we examined their accuracy of both groups as well as the learning curve, so how that adaptation looked throughout the experiment, and we compared those two curves. So my hypothesis was that the experimental group will start at a higher level of accuracy. So when they start the experiment, they're just gonna start off with a bang. They're gonna be a little bit higher. The learning curve will be a little steeper, or they'll learn or adapt quicker, and they'll demonstrate a greater accuracy at the end. And the results looked like that. They started a bit better. The learning curve was a bit steeper. As you can see, the treatment group is a bit, but like actually significantly better at the end. So that makes us ask, why is it that the treatment group does so much better than the control group? And what's interesting about that to me is that both groups got the same input. They had all the same factors going in, and the only difference was a social thing, right? Because they had the exact same chance to do well. All previous work on adaptation has been looking at more cognitive, or you can even say social factors, but those were mostly experimental factors, such as how the stimuli was mixed, or maybe what the task was, and those were the differences between the two subject groups. But here, the control was everything but the pay. So that's clearly something social, which tells us that money is a strong variable of motivation, which I think we all could have guessed. And that motivation here clearly is correlating to the listening effort of this native listeners. And that listening effort also correlates to the adaptation of the speech. So not only are they putting a little more effort, so they're doing a little better, they're also learning faster. So how can we apply that to social hierarchies? By that, I just want to ask, maybe for future studies, how we can examine what that would look like on like a social realm. So if the native speaker was, let's say, interviewing a non-native speaker
what would their listening effort look like in that situation versus if the non-native speaker was the native speaker's boss. So what would the perception look like in those types of situations? And also we can ask, how does this impact how we view, or what does this mean about how we view other humans and our ability to communicate with other humans? So what does this study say? What do these numbers say about how we consciously or subconsciously like view other humans and value our ability to communicate with them if we're exhibiting lesser effort according to the direct incentive of the interaction and what we may get out of that interaction? So moving forward, this work will add to a growing body of evidence that a variety of factors, as we know, both social and cognitive, impact our ability to understand unfamiliar accented speech. And these factors also impact adaptation to that speech over time. I just wanted to thank my, before I end, I want to thank my advisors on this project. It's been really cool to do a cross-departmental research project with both Melissa Bias-Burke from the Linguistics Department and Glenn Waddell from the Econ Department. That's been really cool. I've learned so much working in Melissa's lab and getting Glenn's perspective when it comes to like statistics and econ. And I also wanted to thank everybody that put this this symposium on, because it's just so cool that we're doing this online and there's so many people presenting today, and I appreciate all the effort. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Chasen. Yay, 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 that's so cool. That's wonderful. Yay, so again, I welcome questions. I have so many questions about all these, so I will see how many of those I can sneak in at the end, because I want to know everything. It's good, it's so cool. So now we'll move on to our third presentation, and then afterwards we'll definitely have time for a period of Q&A. So Hayli, if you want to get set up.
This one. Oh.
Yep, and I see the presentation screen.
Okay, good. So I'm Hayli Brown. My major is Japanese and linguistics. I'm a fourth-year student. And I did this project under the mentorship of Kaori Itamaru, who is studying Japanese phonetics in the Speech Language Research Lab. So, and my topic is like, where do you find sources of foreign accentedness in second language Japanese speech? And it's kind of a follow-up to a paper that Itamaru Sensei did last year, or published last year. And the biggest difference is that hers was at the sentence level and mine is at the lexical level. So some of the stuff that she addressed in that paper is that, like, at least at the sentence level, when you're testing somebody's, how someone's second language affects like how accented a native speaker thinks, a native speaker of the second language thinks it sounds, is pitch accent, which is basically just like where the highest pitch is on the word. And in Itamaru's study, pitch accent was the most significant factor affecting like how accented Native Japanese speakers thought English speakers and Chinese speakers. Hers did Chinese speakers, but I didn't do that in mine. Whose second language was Japanese. As opposed to other things like segmental factors, global rhythm, there's a couple other factors, but here we're just, in mine, I'm just focusing on pitch accent because of what she established. Like this was the most significant one. And because, so the reason why this is because English stress is different than Japanese pitch accent, so, which is basically Japanese stress. And English stress relies on duration and intensity, where Japanese does not at all. So my research question was, which pitch accent type creates the strongest perception of foreign accentedness? And I will go over what that is in the next slide. So first thing you need to know is, it's a little hard to define, but the most simplistic way to define a mora is like a rhythmic unit. So it's different than a syllable. In Japanese, it works where each kind of letter, and it's usually like a consonant and a vowel, is going to be one more, except or one unit, one rhythm unit. But the N, like that's not attached to a vowel, will be its own mora, and also geminates, which is like if I said gakko versus gakko, like you have like your throat stopped there a little bit. That geminate counts, I believe it's half, but I'm not looking at that one. And long vowels also count as another moire. So if you have like AA, you have two moires. You don't just have one. So so for example, if we have go, ha, n, it's three moire. So I split it there because it's three moire. But it's two syllables because you just drop your jaw twice and go, ha. So that's how I would explain that one. And this study, in Itamara's study, she looked at three more words and four more words. I'm only looking at three more words. And there's actually 4 pitch accent types, but one of them we're not doing here because you can only do it at the sentence level because it has to do with putting the subject particle after a word, and that changes the pitch type. So obviously there's no subject particle because I'm just doing words, not sentences. And the 3 ones are low, high, 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 low, low, and low, high, low, which I'll call type 0, type 1, and type 2. And it's what it sounds like, low pitch versus high pitch relative to each other. And so I had 20 native English speakers who were learning Japanese at the University of Oregon record 18 words. And they did it with a model, like a native Japanese speaker speaking the word, and then they repeat right after it a few different times, and I take the best one. And we did second and third years instead of second and fourth years, because in the summer, which is when I did this experiment, there's no fourth years. There's no fourth year Japanese class. And then I had 10 native Japanese listeners rate on a computer using ePrime software, rate how accented they thought something was. So like if 100 was like the most foreign, then you'd slide it all the way to the right. And yeah, and then after that, I just averaged. So, and that's here in the results. So you can see, and I'll show you the graph too afterwards. I don't know why it says table 1 and table 2, that messed up. This is just one table. So with the model and the no model, people rated it as less accented with when there was the model, so people just did better on average, whether it was second or third year. And I just want you to, it's the same thing as the graph, but looking at this, at the numbers, you can see just how big of a difference it is. But if you look at the graph, you can see that well, first you can see the difference between model and no model, and that there's not much of a difference between the pitch accent types, but type 0 is always the least accented, which is the high, low, low. So yeah, so better with the model, but doesn't really affect the type. And obviously second year learners were rated as having more of a foreign accent than third year learners, so because they have more experience, and experience matters when it comes to acquiring a native accent. And oh, I mistyped something here because it says high, low, low twice, but with type 1, which was, I definitely mixed these up. Okay, well, anyway, type 1 was rated the most native, but what was interesting was for the second year learners, the most accented one was type 2, which is definitely low, high, low. And for the third year learners, it was type 0, which is high, low, low. So type 1 is the one that's wrong on here because it's unaccented. So we might, you could ask, is type 2 becoming more native, like faster than type 0? But we don't really know that because of a few different things. We don't know if what's actually improving is like segmental things are having less errors as they get more experience. And segmental factors, as established in Livermore's paper, have more of an effect at the lexical level anyway. So maybe pitch accent isn't, like, I doubt it, but maybe it's about the same as segmental and how it affects foreign accentedness, but we don't know because I did not balance the words for, it was impossible to balance the words for controlling, like having the same consonants in each, same vowels, things like that. So so this is basically like a foundation study. There's not a whole lot here because what I wanted to do was, if there was time in the future, was to use this data that I gathered so I can measure pitch error. So like you would specifically be able to see if it was like the pitch that was causing more of the accentedness, because let's say this the pitch error on this word is higher than that one, then you could also compare that to segmental factors, and I'd have to measure the acoustics of the segments, consonants, and vowels, and compare those. So, and as I mentioned earlier, Japanese doesn't use intensity or duration for pitch accent. So if English native English speakers learning Japanese are imposing intensity and duration on Japanese words, then by measuring the intensity or duration of these words, you could tell if that was the reason why this was happening. So that was it. I had one last thing I wanted to say. Isn't it? Oh, I forgot. It wasn't super important. Just something about wanting to use the study for something. Anyway, I'll tell you if it comes back to me. So, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Hayli. Yay, 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 yay. The stuff is everywhere. Yay, yay, yay. Congratulations, students. You did the hard part. You said the things. You can now all just breathe a bit more easily because you're done doing the pre-prepared bit. So now I am happy to open it up to questions. We are wonderfully a small enough group where if you just want to potentially unmute and just ask your question and direct it, you're also welcome to put it in the chat and I'm happy to ask it through that. I have a number of questions and as always, but I'm happy to open it up for engagement of the wonderful guests and faculty people and support systems and all of that that are here. I am really, really happy to have been able to witness and participate in this, sharing a really, really cool research. Just all of them, just so different, but so fascinatingly all focusing on perception and different factors in that. So I'm really excited to hear what else comes out. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand or you can unmute. We can go from there.
So I'd like to just say something because I'm a little bit of an interloper. I'm Joan Siegel. I'm a graduate of the University of Oregon. I did an undergraduate degree in Japanese many years ago, and Hayli I think went to Japan on our scholarship, my husband and I. So I just want to say I really enjoyed your presentation. I did a little bit of linguistics as a graduate student. I didn't do any as an undergraduate, so I think it's terrific that you're looking at it this early. And I want to congratulate the rest of you as well. I really enjoyed all of your presentations. I learned a lot. So I appreciate you letting me sit in and listen. And I just want to wish you all the best, especially in these very difficult times. Good job, all of you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Joan.
Sorry for completely butchering the pitch accent types. Well, the slide for the first slide was correct, and then I got them mixed up. So I can just say that again. The 0 was low, high, high. Type 1 was high, low, low, and type 2 is low, high, low. So
I found that really interesting because I knew what you were talking about. I had never looked at it that way. That wasn't what I focused on when I was looking at it, but I found that very interesting.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, so Hayli, can you remind me which one of the pitch accent types it was that people were faster at learning, getting a kind of native-like perception about? And like, do you think that says anything about like what they're like, so these were English native speakers, right? Like, what does that say about like their English native perception? Was this the pitch accent that was low, high, low? And is it maybe that was kind of the closest to like the way English kind of stress looks like, having this usually like kind of penultimate stress? And so that was, since that was maybe closest to English, maybe that's what was helping them learn that more.
you're actually asking which one was the least accented?
Which one was the one, you said that there was one that people were like fastest at learning a native like perception, right?
Oh yeah, It was different for the
Yeah.
second and third years by a little bit. The numbers are kind of small though. Just double check.
Yeah, I was just wondering if that told us anything about like what is it that makes it easier for people to learn that, and is it anything about the English sound system that's maybe helping them piggyback off of?
Yeah. Type 1. I just want to make sure I'm saying this correct. Oh, excuse me. And I totally flipped that again. Sorry, there was just one that was rated the most native. And that was type 1, which for sure is high, low, low. So like kazoku. So you have you can kind of hear like the stress on the first mora ka. And I don't know enough about like English stress patterns to say for sure if that's like what stress pattern is being imposed from or would not be being imposed, because this one's sounding the most like Japanese. I don't know, because I'd have to think about that.
No, thanks. I was just curious.
Because if you think of like three syllable words in English, umbrella, it's on the second syllable.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was thinking, like, I think a lot of words that we have borrowed into English from other languages like Spanish, they tend to have stress on the second syllable, and where that second syllable would be a higher pitch. And so maybe they're tacking on to like, oh, this is the way that Japanese does this, very different from what we're used to hearing. And so that's what's helping them kind of like pick this up quicker. And so maybe it's really that it's saliently different from what people are used to that's helping them pick up on that quicker. But that's just kind of a hypothesis that stuck out to me of how they might be learning that more quickly. Whereas like the other one that's like low, high, low, then it's more just like how it's being phonetically realized. So then it's like really subtle differences.
Yeah, because that one would follow the rule, the English rule, wouldn't it? So, and like I said, if I was going to do further research with this, which I wanted to, but it was just like too big of a project to do everything all in one summer, was measuring like consonants and seeing like, oh, I don't know, for example, like I think I didn't read it, but it was on the slide. Like voiceless stops have a shorter voice onset time in Japanese than English. So something like that you could measure and see if like in English they're putting more like a longer voice onset time for voiceless consonants onto Japanese words, but I don't know because I didn't acoustically measure them. So
any other questions or comments before I potentially start jumping in and throwing some out there? I think one that I'm thinking about, and that I imagine a lot of people and students are thinking about, and in really these students choosing to push themselves to pursue this line of research or pursue research and present it and share it in this format, I would be curious to hear from as many of the presenters as they feel comfortable, but sharing why or how you got interested or involved in the research that you presented today. So what kind of started this journey that has led you to your wonderful presentation today, if you're comfortable sharing. Yeah, go for it, Chasen.
Yeah, I'll go for it. I I'm guessing that I'm not the only one here with this answer, but Melissa. Really, when I just transferred to the UO last year, and Melissa was my advisor, and right off the bat, she was really pushing me toward, you know, taking opportunities. I was a research assistant in her lab. She was like, you should write a thesis, you should do your own project, all of these things. And after many conversations with her, we kind of landed on this project. And I think that it sprouted also from conversations that she had with Glenn about how money would play a role in a lot of the like perception studies that Melissa has done in the past. So I was really interested in that. And I think also my familial background maybe kind of pushed me toward really being excited about this project. I've had a lot of conversations with like my uncle, for instance, who's from Iran, about his accented speech and where the barrier in communication may come in. And I've actually talked to him like even recently about how like it's not 100% his role to make a successful communication. The listeners also should be putting in effort, you know, to perceive that. And obviously listening effort plays a big role in perception, even on a subconscious level. So that made me kind of excited about this project too.
That's so cool.
I think that's really funny that your project is like a very small relation to mine, because we're both in a foreign accent, and yours is the more practical study. But the reason why I'm studying things like acoustic sources of foreign accent perception is important is so like you be more aware of those things, and I don't really know, like from this, not from a moral standpoint, but from a practical standpoint, some people, you know, don't want to have an accent. I think most people don't want to have an accent when they learn a second language, and learning like the things that go into having a native accent is important in learning in order to get rid of those. But I definitely think not from a moral standpoint, I don't think people should have to, you know, get rid of their accents or whatever, but in the meantime, it's like a way of fitting in.
Any other thoughts and reflections on why you were interested or got involved in actually pursuing a full research project? I'm curious, now that many of you are at stages where you're presenting and kind of reflecting on your entire research project, I'm curious in terms of the learning process that you have gone through in conducting the research and processing it, and processing stages of it and writing it up. I'm curious if you had the opportunity to maybe replicate or to reimagine how you were going about doing this research, what would you consider doing differently in that replication, given challenges or insights or things that you learned along the way, that you think would support or strengthen or kind of help solidify the results that you've begun to really share from these studies? Mm-hmm. Yeah, go for it, Sam.
I just think like one of the biggest problems with our research was our sample. We were getting it out to whoever we could, but ultimately, like through like online format, there's only so much we can do. So if possible, I would prefer to do an in-person version of our survey so we could expand to more groups and more communities at the University of Oregon and not just the ones we have easiest contact to.
I'm curious maybe then from that, thinking about different in-person spaces or spaces at the UO, are there specific spaces that you were focusing on or that you're wanting to try and not target, but kind of do more outreach to specifically to help kind of flesh out and fill out the rest of your sample? I'm curious if there are anything like that, because I imagine that there's some ideas, but still a little random no matter what.
Yeah, totally. It's all definitely somewhat random. I think in order to get the biggest, like the least biased sample, you'd have to go to like public spaces where everyone pretty much goes to, like the EMU or some lecture hall, but then it depends on which one. Yeah, it's difficult, but I guess you just have to go to several places and try to find the most neutral ones. And if you can't find a neutral one, then try to go to as many as you can so you reach as many groups as you can. We didn't have any specific places in mind, I don't think, but that's kind of our thinking.
Yeah, if I can kind of jump off of that too, just one example of like a way that our data was very limited was as far as like university affiliation. We got mostly undergraduates, a good handful of grad students, but only 2 faculty or instructors and no administrators or other staff. And we weren't just wanting to look at students, we were wanting to look at like the university community as a whole. So having the ability to like go into Oregon Hall or Tyson or, you know, the res halls and various places on campus that represent more than just the undergraduate and grad student communities would have really been useful to us. So that's just like one example.
Any other thoughts of differences or maybe thinking about kind of what a next step or a next goal for your line of research, if it's connected or if it's parallel or anything like that? Continuing off of this wonderful work you've already done. Yeah, Chasen?
Oh, I was gonna say, in terms of differences, I don't know how this would work since mine was a paid study, but if I had to do it again, I would really actually kind of opposite to what they were saying. I would love to try and do it online. Now I know the time and effort that it takes to like run 50 subjects in a lab and like scheduling that by yourself, it's like a lot. I also have learned a lot from this process and like have made mistakes, of course, and learned more about like the ethics of being in a lab. And I think that it was like a very valuable experience in that way. But after having a Qualtrics workshop with Zach, I was like, wow, if this could have been how I did my experiment, that would have been awesome. So if I could do that, I would. I don't know how we would pay someone online though, so maybe I would look into that for future studies.
Because then your reach also can be so much more expanded as well, given resources, of course, because the joy of research.
Yeah, that was my biggest regret was not having more time because it's very, like, what I have now and what I've written up is very bare bones, and like I can't, tell you like why exactly it's this pitch accent type that's different. It's more accented than the others. So I wanted, but it's a lot of words to go through and measure all like the segments and intensity and duration. Like you have to pick. So.
Well, and I imagine that's definitely one reason why many faculty researchers that I know, they get one data set and then they use it for like 50 million things. They're like, I'm just going to look at every aspect of this one thing. I'm going to look at it for so long because there's so much data here. It really sounds like all three of these projects have really been trying to grab onto things that can be used and applied and analyzed in a bunch of different ways and are with drastically different implications in different aspects of the field. If it's perception of someone else, production from someone, social implications or social perceptions of that. I definitely think that somehow these three linguistics projects really do show a really cool like social linguistic relationship and how we are all perceiving and sharing and producing in our own way. I think that's super cool. The random happenstance way that we find ourselves in. Are there any other comments or questions or reflections perhaps from guests or presenters or anything like that? There's been a lot of thought shared already this morning, so and Zoom is a weird format, so I totally get to speak like, okay, I have to do more of this later.
I guess just kind of a question that I think for Chasen, I was curious, and also I think also for the pronoun usage research, I feel like this has a lot of social implications, and I was just wondering what you think would be your takeaway if you were talking to someone else about like, I found this thing and here's like what I want you to know about this to, you know, maybe if this is like to make the world a better place or to like do things to help people, like here's kind of like my new message that I learned from this that like helped me think about things in a helpful way.
Ooh, that's kind of a loaded question. But actually, I think there's kind of two takeaways that I got from doing this experiment, and one I think was maybe a little more obvious, that like money is a motivator, and people, you know, act differently or think differently, even subconsciously, because of money as like a social factor. But I think the thing that to me feels maybe a little more important as a takeaway and like what I would tell people is just like reiterating this idea of listening effort being just as important in a communication as the speaker. So really meeting halfway in that communication and understanding that we can be more conscious about our listening effort, and subconsciously these types of things, both cognitively and socially, may be going on. So just reiterating that idea that like, okay, we have all these studies and all these numbers that prove this is true. Okay, but maybe we could have realized that anyway. We can like look at these numbers just to, again, prove that we can put more listening effort in and make some of what's going on subconsciously, make that a little more conscious. I think that's what I would tell people if they were to ask about this study. Because the numbers really...
I heard that really well. Like, I think just that you can put effort into this and that has an effect. And I think also that like incentive matters and that there are different kinds of incentives. I think that came through really well. And I loved the example you gave at the end about like, does this have an effect if someone is like your boss versus your employee? And that's getting like somewhat directly at the money factor, but it's not exactly the same as the money factor. So I think there's a lot of directions that we can take that in, and asking ourselves like, what are our incentives, and does this have to necessarily be so directly about being paid for doing better?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, yeah, thank you. I'm excited to see what directions this research will go.
I think there was also maybe a follow-up in that question from Zach about, or to the pronoun perception group of, implications or messaging, or if this is changing or impacting how you're talking about this research or lines of this research implications?
Yeah, I can even make it a little more tangible. I was really curious. So I know that you had a lot of trouble, especially with the fact that so many of these things are really correlated, right? So like you looked at kind of the like political like orientation, and then you saw like religious things, or you saw like people's like attitudes or affinities regarding LGBT issues. And like a lot of those patterns might be because those things themselves are related to each other, right? But I think one thing that really stuck out to me was that when you looked at the effect of, do people know someone who uses they, them pronouns? Like that's something that like you still found some people who know someone who uses they, them pronouns, and you still had at least a few people who didn't know someone who uses that. But you still found a similar pattern, and that's a factor where like that might not necessarily go hand in hand with these kinds of like attitudes or like kind of religious beliefs or political beliefs that people might have. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, and how maybe that's a way of teasing apart like people's experience from their beliefs, and if maybe that's a direction that we can kind of proceed in thinking about like how to think about they, them pronouns, or how to talk about that in terms of people's experiences, and if this is how we're wanting to speak to people's beliefs about they, them pronouns.
Yeah, I can definitely respond to that at least a little bit. One of the things that we did find in the data, which is pretty kind of interesting, is, I mean, like you said, there are obviously a lot of them are correlated. That specific one wasn't always necessarily correlated with the others, and definitely one thing that I'd like to look at, you know, if we got a lot more data, was whether that sort of variable of knowing someone who uses they, them pronouns could be strong enough to sort of outweigh some demographic variables on the other side. I have like an anecdotal example in my personal life, which is why I kind of latched onto that as one possible question, in that I have an acquaintance who is pretty politically conservative, and I think kind of doesn't necessarily have the most, I mean, they're not like anti-LGBT, but is sort of like indifferent to most LGBT issues. But we have a mutual friend who does use they, them pronouns, and they never misgender them. So even though like, or at least when they're around me, I don't know if that's the case when I'm not there, but it is, I think, an example of like a situation where maybe just like having that personal respect for someone is kind of a situation that there might be like, you know, I will use someone's pronouns even if I don't really, you know, I guess agree with what's behind it. And that's one of the reasons that we really wanted to do interviews, to sort of follow up, because like, again, our kind of ultimate goal with what we're trying to find with this research, and also part of the reason that we localized it to University of Oregon specifically, is we're not just trying to find, okay, what are the demographic factors, but like why, and like how are they, basically how do these demographic factors shape people's perceptions of them, with the sort of ultimate practical goal of figuring out how we can use that information to create messaging and basically make the campus a place that is encouraging people to be more open to they, them pronouns. And, you know, like, how can we kind of target the things that make people have less of a perception, or like, I guess a more negative perception, and like find out, okay, what's the reason behind that, right? Why is it that, for instance, like we did see a correlation with the more liberal someone might lean, the more likely they would be to support they, them pronouns, and yet the only person who identified as strongly conservative in our entire sample was very much pro usage of they, them pronouns. Like, what is it about those outliers that make them outliers. And so that's like one of the things that we wanted to address in interviews. I think I sort of responded to your question, but yeah.
Well, I'm also curious, like, how did you assess people's political beliefs in the survey questions?
That one's pretty straightforward. We had here, I can actually, wait, never mind. I don't even really need to pull it up. It was basically a 6-point scale, and people could, it just said like, how would you, I don't actually remember the exact text of the question, but basically which of the following best represents your political beliefs? And it was very conservative, conservative, somewhat liberal, liberal, and very liberal. It's the exact phrasing and question that Pew Research Center uses for their demographic questions. So most of our demographic questions that are just sort of demographic questions that are generally, commonly used, we copied exactly how they're phrased from Pew Research Center because, we figured they have a lot more experience in polling and surveys than we do. And they've probably actually had people figure out the best way to phrase questions. And so it's a way for us to not really have to worry about how to phrase those questions.
There's a question that popped up in the chat. Danni, do you want to read your question? I'm happy to read it to give Chasen a chance to respond. We have about a little over 5-ish minutes left because there are other sessions starting at 11:30. Yeah, and I am happy to read it. I know most of us here are familiar with linguistics, but I personally know very little about economics. Can you talk a little bit about the econ side of your experiment, both the design and the findings? The intersection between linguistics and economics isn't one I've ever considered before, so I'm really interested in how you navigated that and whether it's influenced your perspectives on either field. Yeah, that is a wild combo that I was not personally expecting. When I saw that, I was like, oh, wow, okay.
Yeah, maybe after I speak, Melissa can go a little bit more in depth on her conversations from the econ side. To me, where the intersectionality is the fact that like economics, more so like money, is something that like socially affects all of us. And I think that's kind of where this intersection came from, which I've reiterated here. But when it comes to exactly like what I know about econ is like pretty slim. So I can't really give an econ lesson right now. I am a linguist for sure, but I do know that when it comes to econ, like what's relevant here is the fact that our condition is something that's economic and it is money, and how we can relay that further into economics, like social status or like further like class, is something to me that is purely economic and not really a linguistic factor at all. So yeah, that's where econ came into play for me. And I think that's why Glenn was really, Professor Waddell was really interested in this study, was that realizing that communication or linguistics is kind of relevant to most fields because you can look at linguistics from all these perspectives. So I think we all thought it was really exciting that to look at something linguistic from this social but also economic perspective. And I think the intersectionality between like department or like cross-departmental research is something that like I would like to see more. And I was really excited about the idea of doing something from an econ perspective. Though I will say, Danni, I also don't know that much about econ, and I haven't even studied econ. I'm not studying econ at all, but maybe, I don't know if Melissa, you want to elaborate a little bit?
I think I can just say that, this sort of economics that Glenn does is microeconomics. So like economic systems on smaller scales and the role of economic incentive, that sort of stuff, hierarchies within organizations. And so I've done a lot of work in the past on accent adaptation. And I think Glenn was really interested in this idea of like, well, plus we're friends. And so I always like to work with my friends. So I try to find intersections of things all the time. But this particular one, we were talking a little bit about what might impact performance, because as Chasen so eloquently said earlier, there's this idea that if you're a listener, you can actually try harder. But how can we get people to try harder? Is it the case that it's just non-native speech is really hard to understand, and that's just where we're going to land on that? Because if that's the case, then the answer to making things better is just lots and lots of practice. But if it's the case that instead we can motivate people through really simple behavioral incentives, then that tells us something different about what's actually going on here. It's not just the case that you need more practice. You need to want to be good at it, right? And so I think that's a really powerful message, but also something that we can't get just within the linguistic domain. Like, I don't have expertise, for example, in how incentive influences motivation, and Glenn does.
Yeah, I was actually wondering a little bit about that too. And in terms of like, because I loved the like boss versus employee example so much. And I was thinking about that kind of extracted a little bit away from the money, but how it still could relate to money in that example. But then I was wondering if the economic perspective might bring a little bit more nuance into that. So like you could example money being related to both someone wanting to adapt their attunement to their boss, and that could be an incentive in a way of like they have more of a chance for promotion. But you could also imagine a boss being motivated or incentivized to attune to their employee, because then that could help like their business that they're conducting run more efficiently, and then them gaining more money. So I was just wondering if like in economics there is kind of an idea of teasing those things apart, and that one might be considered more directly incentive and another is more about like cost or punishment or pressure or something like that, or if those would be kind of considered the same relative thing.
Yeah, so I think the idea is to try to tease those things apart through a variety of tasks, both tasks where you're paid based on other people's performance versus you're paid based on your own performance. And then also looking at the sort of hierarchy and how that plays into both the kind of perception things that we've been looking at, but also people's self-reports of why they're doing what they're doing, why they're trying harder or not harder, whether they're trying harder. So that's more the econ side. So those are sort of next steps from Glenn's and my perspective for the work that Chasen has really beautifully started here.
Yay, and there are so many directions to take all of this,
Yeah.
Excitingly.
Yeah, and while I'm unmuted, I'll just say congratulations to everybody. Hayli is not specifically one of my people, but I've had Hayli in class, and so I'm super proud of everybody. This is all just really amazing work. And for my FIG group, you guys these are first year students, the 4 people who are presenting here. So like really astounding and remarkable work that you should be really proud of.
Yes, me too. And I got to see Melissa sent me the survey, and I got to see the survey, and I even told her, I was like, this is such a well-designed survey for like a first year survey. So that's well done. And I've gotten to work with Chasen in the lab as well as Hayli in the lab. So I also am very proud of all the work that you all are doing.
Congratulations, everyone. It is now the end of our session. All the students have survived, and you are still alive, and you are still moving forward through week 8. So I want to wish you all the best with the remainders of your quarters, and in continuing this research and continuing to learn and be linguists and in all different forms that is. It has been truly so fun to be able to hear about your research and be witness to all of that. And I truly wish you all the best. Okay. I hope everyone has a good rest of their Thursdays. And if you're seeing other presentations later, so cool. If you have class, life happens. Of course. Okay. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.